From the studios of KPFT in Houston, welcome to this week's edition of The Monitor. My name is Mark Babawi. My co-host is Emily Becker, and we have a guest and co-host, I guess. I was going to say guest co-host, but you're both. Egberto Willies is joining us. We're going to be talking to him first instead of the news headlines. But let me just give you a quick rundown of this week's show, because it's a little bit unusual. Normally in the beginning, we would be doing news headlines, but instead we're going to be talking to Egberto. So welcome, first of all.
Well, thank you for having me, sir. How are you doing today?
I'm good.
Great.
I'm here. We have two guests after that. So the usual format once the first segment is over. The first guest is John Kiriakou. He's a former CIA counterterrorism officer and a former senior investigator for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He's now a columnist for a website called OtherWords. And we have a link to his website and his latest column, which we'll be discussing with him on the show this week. It is called Let's Talk About Torture, in which John takes aim, I think, fairly squarely at Bush-era CIA Directors George Tenet, Porter Goss, and Michael Hayden, and several of their underlings who have recently announced a plan to release a book, predictably perhaps, justifying torture. So we'll see what John thinks of that. I have an idea he might not like it. Our second guest after the break will be Steve Horn. He's the editor of DSmog blog, and he recently wrote a piece called Hillary Clinton State Department Emails, Mexico Energy Reform, and the Revolving Door. Steve will be our final guest for the show. So normally at this point we'd be getting into news headlines, and I'd be reminding people to go take a look at the website, which they still can do, obviously, and that is themonitor.wordpress.com. You can also go to facebook.com/monitorradio. You can follow me on Twitter at Mark Babawi. You can also follow all three of our guests. Our first guest is Egberto Willies. His Twitter handle is, predictably, Egberto Willies. Egberto, I had this idea that probably somewhat similar to my experience with KPFT, people have specific times of the day or the week where they listen, and they may not be exposed to other shows, and they may not even know that your show exists. I suspect that there are people who listen to your show that don't know this show exists, and so I'm trying to cross-pollinate a little bit. So tell people about your show. It's Thursdays at 3, and it's called Politics Done Right. What can people expect if they tune in?
If you my show is called Politics Done Right, and it's on Thursdays at 3 p.m. And what I do is I try to engage the community. It's not only a local show, but it's a national show where we actually try to get the average person in the body politic to engage. Most people think that they cannot be a part of politics. I mean, your show is excellent in what I like to call the academia of politics. What we try to do at Politics Done Right is bring it closer to folks who think they don't have the ability or the wherewithal to be a part of the body politic. We try to get them to engage, and we also try to get them to actually put their voices out there and get their voices on air, because what I find is a lot of times people have a lot to say, but they don't think they have the right to say it or the worth to say it.
Or the place to say it.
Or the place to say it, exactly,
right.
Exactly. So what we're trying to do is tell folks that you're a part of America, and just like you can watch TV and see all those pundits on, you get your opportunity to do that as well on Politics Done Right.
So it's a little bit like a C-SPAN call-in show in that sense. There's a topic, I guess, for the week, and you have ideas that you want to get through, but you solicit opinion and people call in.
Right. What I do is I generally start the show with something I call the blog of the week. And the blog of the week is something that I research for quite a bit. You know, most of the times it's something that's happening, and then we have a discussion on the blog of the week. Now, the thing about it is what I call the show as well as a people's show. What that means is, if I may have an idea of what I want the blog of the week to be, but something may be happening that people want to talk about something else. So we get the meat of the blog of the week out of the way, and we either discuss it, or folks may call in and actually have the subject changed.
Change the subject completely.
But it's their show, so they get the ability they have the ability to do that.
And it's every Thursday, and it's 3 p.m. It's an hour?
Right. Every Thursday at 3 p.m. for 1 hour.
For 1 hour. Okay. So I guess one of the questions I have with it being a call-in show is, do you have people who call in all the time, or do you have people who you don't recognize? Is it a mixture? What sort of participation?
It is a great mixture, because what you find is you have your groupies, right? The folks that will always call you every time that they can. But what I'm starting to find is that the surfers, the radio surfers, are starting to call as well. And then there are listeners that have been listening for quite a while who hadn't had the courage to call, and they're suddenly with the constant trying to get people involved, they're getting up to speed, or they're getting the courage, and they're calling in and saying report. There's an interesting thing that happened last Thursday. Everybody who called were males. And I said, look, it's almost done with the show, and we haven't heard from a woman yet. And at that point, there was one call on the line. As soon as I said that, the whole thing lit up. So it was great, because you felt that engagement with the people that were actually listening to your show.
Before I started hosting this show, I used to do the boards, the engineering for Saeed's show, Arab Voices. And there were people who would call in every week. And,
right.
And there was also a fairly short list of people who it seemed would call in every call-in show.
Right.
And I was always a little bit hesitant as to where they might take the show or how they might derail the topic, because that show also had a guest.
Right.
So your show, you don't have a guest. It's you and the listeners.
It's me and the listeners. Now, every so often I bring guests, since going forward, especially since it's the election season, I'll likely have a whole lot of politicians in here in the studio. But the idea is not going to be the politician using the show for a propaganda machine. It's going to be, I'll talk to the politician for a little bit, and then let the people talk to the politician. And, for me, it's going to be always the folks out there, and that's going to be leading the show.
So this brings up another question, and it's something that I wrestle with every election season, and that is that the Federal Election Commission has rules about so-called fair play or equal airtime, or which on TV was a doctrine that was undone by Reagan.
Yes.
So how do you deal with elections and either expressing or not expressing your own opinion, and staying within the rules, but also being honest with your audience?
Well, my audience know that I am a left-wing liberal. I tell them that almost every single session. I also tell folks that the intent of my show is not to listen to only left-wing liberals. I want everybody on my show. So I encourage Republicans, anarchists, communists, socialists, libertarians,
right,
everybody to come on the show. And you know what? Sometimes I get them. So the idea is that I am not shy about what my political affiliation is. I'm not shy about where I stand from a political standpoint. But what I try to do is say, this is community radio, and I want to hear everybody's point of view. And I really don't have a problem to have folks call in and talk, because I'm with another group called the Coffee Party USA, and one of the things that we try to do is introduce dialogue into our system, because there's too much, as you know, of the Rush Limbaughs and the Hannity. So my show is nothing like that. I don't care where you come from. You'll always, first of all, as the host, I'm always extremely respectful to anybody who calls in, no matter what tone they use when they call in. And generally, even those that call in very wild and with a wild tone, ready to have my head on a platter, by the time the conversation ends, whether we agree or disagree, we have a conversation.
Well, that's important. And Emily, I don't want to hog the conversation, so jump in if you have questions as well. So I guess the other concern that I have about call-ins, and I sort of alluded to it, is that sometimes people can call in and completely change the subject.
Yes.
With this show, sometimes when technical issues have led to guests not being available, or phone lines have had a problem or something, we'll open the lines. But I've always been very impressed with the quality of phone calls that we get, and I don't know if it sort of I guess in some way undermines an assumption that a lot of media has, that topics are too complicated, that we can't really get into this, that people don't understand. I think that it does. And I don't know if you would agree with, I know Robert Muhammad, for example, says the people are smarter than you think.
I think it's two answers, right? One is, the people are smarter than we think many times. But the second one is, the quality of your show determines a lot of times your listenership. Okay, so if you have a good quality show, of which you have like I tell folks all the time, I'm an engineer by training, okay? So, and they're scientists. In the broadcast type business, somebody like yourself and Emily, who are in the school system and the university system and the PhD levels and all that kind of stuff, you are the scientists of the media, of the media domain. There are others in the media domain that they are the populists. I consider myself the populist in the media domain, and I think you need both sides. So whereas some programs do well to have people call in, or would be best based on people calling in, I don't think all of them should be that way. Because as an example, when I talk about your show, when I'm coming into the show before and listening to your show, one of the things that I like is the level of complexity that you can get out of a guess. Then somebody like me, the engineer who is the populist, can actually break that down in a certain way to the people at large. So I think both of them are needed. I think both styles are actually needed for that type of interaction with the public at large.
Okay, well, I have tuned in, and I encourage people to do so. The show is called Politics Done Right. The host is Egberto Willies. He's joining us this week, and he's actually going to be staying with us for the remainder of the show, so you might hear him pipe in with questions for either of our guests, John Kiriakou up next, and Steve Horn, second guest. Thursdays at 3. Egberto, any final closing sentiments for people before we sort of let you go, although you're staying here for the rest of the show?
Yeah, please tune into the show and call into the show, and actually make sure to go. KPFT has a whole lot of good talk shows interspaced with the other good programming that we have. Look them up and listen to them all.
And I should point out this show is carried by several other stations around the country at different times of the week, and so people might be listening in not on a Monday and wondering if they can hear your show and call in as well, and they can. You can listen to KPFT streaming on the internet from anywhere in the world, obviously.
Right.
And if you're willing to pay for the long-distance phone call, then you can call the station during Egberto's show, and that number is the usual number that everyone in KPFT land knows, 713-526-5738, of course, and you can call in and have your say. So we encourage you to do that.
Thank you very much.
Well, our engineer, Robert Gartner, has our first guest on hold already, so I think we'll go to a very short musical break, and we'll be right back with John Kiriakou. Stay tuned. Welcome back to The Monitor. My name is Mark Babawi. My co-host is Emily Becker, and our guest co-host is Egberto Willies, who's joining us just for this week's show. Our first guest, second guest really, would be John Kiriakou. John, welcome back.
Thanks for having me again.
It's good to have you back on. John is no stranger to this show. I think, John, you did the first interview after the restrictions were placed on you by the Department of Justice after you were finally able to speak. So it was a pleasure and a privilege to have you on for that.
Thank you.
For people who haven't heard of you, John is a former CIA counterterrorism officer, a former senior investigator for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and the only person in what I think is a travesty, really, to serve any jail time in anything connected with torture, and not because John was involved in the torture, but because he blew the whistle on it. John is now a columnist with OtherWords, and we have a link to his latest piece on there called Let's Talk About Torture. John, you take a pretty square aim at several of the Bush-era CIA directors, notably George Tenet, Porter Goss, and Michael Hayden, who are planning now to release a book. Tell people what this book is going to be about and what your issues are with those people and what's going to be in their book.
Yes, these three former CIA directors that you mentioned, George Tenet, Porter Goss, and Michael Hayden, and 5 other Bush-era senior CIA officers, everybody from Mike Morrell and John McLaughlin to Jose Rodriguez and Philip Mudd, former general counsel of the CIA, John Rizzo, they all wrote this book together that takes aim at the Senate torture report. And really, to make a long story short, it tries to justify the torture program. It tries to argue that torture worked, that torture was moral, and that it saved American lives. And I thought there was no sense in pulling any punches. This is a big lie that they have tried to perpetrate and to perpetuate since they left office. I was going to call it what it was, and I wrote this column for OtherWords.org.
And so, for people who haven't had a chance to read that, and we went over some of these arguments before, and I've discussed them at length with various people in the intelligence community and the legal community about the efficacy and legality or illegality of torture. Just from your experience in the CIA and in the intelligence world, tell people what the issues are with torture. I mean, we see TV shows like 24 and various other things that seem to show that if you lean on someone hard enough, they'll tell you exactly what you need to know, and it'll be reliable and dependable and truthful?
It should be so simple. The truth is, and psychiatrists and psychologists have argued this for many, many years, torture doesn't work. Torture never works. The person being tortured simply will tell his torturer what he thinks that person wants to hear just to make the torture stop. I think one thing that many Americans forget is that the documents that the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence used to write the torture report were primary source documents. These were contemporaneously written CIA documents from the field to CIA headquarters as the torture program was taking place. So we know firsthand that the torture did not work, that the torture did not result in any actionable intelligence, no attacks were disrupted, and no American lives were saved.
And you're comfortable stating that categorically?
Categorically. There is absolutely no truth to this contention by George Tenet and the others that torture worked. Never mind the argument that it was illegal. You know, the United States is signatory to a number of international treaties and conventions, most specifically the United Nations Convention Against Torture, which specifically prohibits exactly the kinds of techniques that the CIA was using in its secret prisons overseas.
It's so distressing to me, and I hesitate to say this while you're on the air with us because, in a way, you're the only person who paid the most direct price, other than, of course, the people who are tortured. But you're the only intelligence analyst, official, CIA employee or contractor who's served time in prison for torture, but not for actually torturing. I mean, what sort of response did you get when you were still in the CIA and when you tried to blow the whistle internally about this? What did people in officialdom say to you? Were you just a troublemaker, or did they try and argue the points with you, or what was the response? I was told by one senior officer that I had displayed what he called a shocking lack of commitment to counterterrorism. That was the first time anybody criticized me on this issue. It was a shocking lack of commitment to counterterrorism. And then I sort of became known as the human rights guy, and people stopped asking me things related to torture or to interrogation. Nobody asked my opinion after a while, and that was perfectly fine. But one of the things that was very disappointing to me was that no one else came forward. Not after I went on ABC News in 2007 and said that the CIA was torturing its prisoners, not after the Senate torture report was released. So we know now from that torture report that there were CIA officers in the field who were writing back to headquarters and saying, this is wrong, it's torture, I don't want to have any role in it, but they've never gone public, and they've never said anything about what led to their decision to walk away from the torture program. And that's very disappointing to me. How many of those people do you think had the opportunity to come forward before you went public, and then we can talk about why they might not have done after you went public, because the lessons there for them, I think, are pretty obvious.
Well, I didn't go public until December of 2007, and this torture program was really running full tilt from 2002 to 2005. So we're talking about at least 2 or 2.5 years where someone could have come forward and could have said something. And we knew that there was torture taking place because there had been leaks to Human Rights Watch, there had been leaks to Amnesty International, and even the International Committee of the Red Cross had written an internal report saying the CIA was torturing its prisoners. So we know that somebody was talking at some point.
But not to the media necessarily?
No, not to the media.
Okay. So, I mean, I guess after you came forward and people saw what happened to you, the way the administration went after you, and this didn't just end, obviously, with the Bush administration, the Obama administration continued the same fight. What is your take on... I mean, I guess the obvious motivation for these CIA directors and their underlings, as you put it, trying to justify torture and claiming not only that they had the legal authority but that it was effective, there are obvious political motivations for that. What are the other motivations?
Absolutely. I think this is more about legacy than anything else. These men all had long careers in intelligence, and when it comes right down to it, the torture program is their legacy. When their obituaries are written, it's going to mention that they were the creators and the implementers of the torture program. And they want to repeat this lie that torture worked over and over and over again with the hope that the American people are so stupid or so gullible that they'll believe it, and that will change their own history. So I think it's really about their place in history and their personal legacies.
And there's also the issue of patriotism, right? I mean, the idea that if you question anything the administration does, whatever the administration might be, to use George Bush's words, that you're either with us or you're against us. So any dissent means you're on the side of terrorism.
Yes. This is something that I've argued since I was a teenager. Progressives are patriots too. You don't have to out-hawk the hawk in order to prove your patriotism. It's patriotic to stand up against torture. It's patriotic to want our country to respect its international agreements and treaties.
So you said that you were accused of a lack of commitment to counterterrorism. One of the things that I've said on this show multiple times, various opportunities that I've had when this topic comes up, is that torture, along with the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan and the drone program, actually creates terrorism. Did you ever have a response to these people that actually were creating more terrorism with this torture?
Yeah, many of us believe that at the agency, including several senior-level officers. But I think that it's a proven fact that some of these programs create new terrorists. I've interviewed or interrogated myself young Al-Qaeda fighters who had no problem with the United States, had no intention of taking up arms, until a drone flew over their village and killed their cousin or brother or fill in the blank with a family member. It's these attacks that anger whole segments of the populace, and that really buck people up who decide then to go to Afghanistan or to Iraq or to wherever to make jihad against the Americans.
So how do you convince people who, and I'm one of them, who would think that, this CIA torture program, which I guess officially existed from 2002 and we're told is now officially over, that in fact it still goes on, that renditions probably still happen, that black sites still exist, that there are still people in Guantanamo and other places who are likely being mistreated. What do you say to that rather cynical position?
I would say that I would not bet money that the torture program has gone away. Look, nobody has said anything about banning renditions.
Right.
The renditions can be an absolutely horrible thing that lead to torture, but even the Senate torture report hasn't addressed renditions. So I would guess that renditions are still taking place. Now, the CIA lies about just about everything.
Well, that shouldn't surprise anybody, right?
Right, it shouldn't surprise anybody. They lied to the Senate investigators. They tapped the Senate investigators' phones and spied on the. My son just walked down the steps and I lost my train of thought. But anyway, over the years,
they interfered with the computers as well, right?
With oversight committees, and now we're supposed to take their word for it that torture has ended. We keep hearing that there are no more black sites. Well, I mean, how do we know that there are no more black sites? What about the new prison that was built at Bagram Air Base? Is that ours, or is it the Afghans? Who's being held in it? And do they have access to the Red Cross? I don't think those questions have been answered.
Right. Egberto, I think, wants to jump in here.
Yeah, I have a question, and it goes as follows. First, you said that torture does not work. Do you think these guys believe that it works, or do you think there is some ulterior motive that they're actually still with the torture program, or still, doing renditions, etc.?
Yeah, I'm not sure that they really believe that torture works because there's so much evidence. Again, primary source documentation that it doesn't work. But I think that they think that they made a decision, they have to stick with that decision, they have to justify the decision, and they're going to go to their graves arguing for it. So I think, again, it's a legacy issue.
I wanted to... is it that, or do you think it could be more sinister, that what we really need to ensure is that we, in fact, have conflict throughout the world at all the time?
Well, that I agree with you with. If there's no conflict, if there's no war, then the military-industrial complex makes no money. There's no work for this gigantic bureaucracy that the CIA and NSA and associated agencies have become. What do you do with all those people? Those people only work and only prosper and only thrive when there's a war to fight.
Exactly.
That gets to the heart of one of the sort of ongoing themes of this show, and that is, trying to solve problems by following the same failed methods should not surprise anyone that continues to produce the same outcomes. Someone at some point said that was the definition of insanity.
Insanity.
And may I add something to that?
Yeah, please do.
We should be just as angry with the congressional oversight committees as we are with anybody else that's involved in this, because these oversight committees not only are fully briefed on all of these programs, but they're the ones who go to the Appropriations Committee and argue for their funding.
Mm-hmm.
And, the Frank Churches of the world are gone. It seems like you can only choose for committee membership between neoconservatives and neoliberals, and they're both going to get us into the same mess. And there's really no adult supervision on Capitol Hill.
So John, when you joined the CIA, what was your motivation initially? What did you discover when you spent time there? And what would you say to someone today who might be thinking about that kind of career path?
I've forbidden my children. I have 5 children. I have forbidden them from ever applying to the CIA, to the FBI, or to the NSA. I joined the CIA in January of 1990. I was recruited in graduate school to work in the CIA's Directorate of Intelligence. That's the analytic arm. And that was a period of time, a period that lasted from the Church Committee hearings in 1976 until September 11th, where there was a hard and fast rule that the CIA, whether it liked it or not, had to respect human rights. And as a result, on the operations side, our operators were not allowed to recruit any potential sources who had human rights abuses in their own past. Now, I thought that was laudable. As a result, we didn't get a lot of the information that we otherwise might have gotten, but it was the right thing to do. So I was very idealistic. I came from an immigrant household, and my grandfather kept a picture of Franklin Roosevelt on the top of the television all my life. And he instilled in my brother and sister and me the idea that the country was so kind to us to let us in when we needed help the most at the height of the Great Depression, that we needed to do something across the generations to pay back that hospitality. And that thing was public service. He always urged me to go into public service. And so when I was in grad school and my graduate school advisor approached me about working for the CIA, I thought, wow, great. Not only will it be interesting and I'll get to see the world, but I'll get to pay that back to the country that's been so good to us. And so I gladly went into the CIA. It was only, I'm going to say, 8 years later when I told my boss that I was going to switch over to operations. And he pulled me aside and he said, they kill people over there. And I said, oh, come on, you watch too many movies. And he said, no, I'm serious. They kill people over there. And I said, well, that's not me. That's not my thing. And it wasn't really until September 11th that I realized they really do kill a lot of people over there.
And over there, you mean the operations side instead of the analytical side?
Correct.
So I guess if you're still driven, I don't mean you individually, but anyone who might still be driven by this idea of public service and of repaying the country for whatever they think the country has done for them, and you're telling people that you would explicitly forbid your children from joining the CIA, what other alternatives are there?
Well, there are things like, this is going to sound maybe like a little bit of a cliche, but there's the Peace Corps, and there's the Foreign Service, the U.S. Information Service. There's a lot that you can do to serve your country and promote American ideals that we all like to think we have. But I think that our intelligence services are out of control, and that's not one of them. Now, I used to believe that the only way to change the CIA was from the inside, that the CIA is a permanent organization, permanent structure, bureaucratic structure, and the only way to change it is from the inside. I'm not sure I believe that anymore. Daniel Patrick Moynihan wrote a book in 1976 in which he advocated for the breakup of the CIA, and people mocked him, on Capitol Hill and off. But we know now also that John Kennedy wanted to break up the CIA.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, this is probably something we should be debating.
And it's not.
It's not.
It's not even a conversation.
Is there really a reason for a CIA? Certainly, human intelligence can be collected by Defense Department. They have their own bureau called Defense Human Services, Certainly analysis can be done either at DIA or at the State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research. The CIA's Science and Technology Directorate can be spread over a number of, more than a dozen government agencies. So do we really need a CIA? I think no, not anymore.
Seems like that what we're looking at is as government sort of feeding on itself. I don't know that a president has the courage, or any president would have the courage to actually shut down the CIA or any one of those organizations, especially in these times where most Americans are freaked out about this great terrorist non-threat that we actually are looking at.
I think you're right, and that's the propagandization of our own people.
Well, so John, and this might be the last question we have because we're going to run out of time here in a few minutes, but given the current situation in Iraq and Syria and the rise of ISIS or ISIL or Daesh or whatever name you want to give that group, what is the role of intelligence? And if you had the ear of either this president or whoever the incoming president was going to be, what would you suggest would be an appropriate policy to deal with the crisis over there?
Oh,
and I know that's a huge question, which is why I'm giving you a few minutes.
The first thing I would do, literally the first thing I would do, would be to cut off arms sales to the entire region, because the arms always end up in either the wrong hands or they corrupt the people with the right hands. And you look at the weapons that ISIS has, and they're American weapons, and they're the same weapons that the Iraqi government had before ISIS. At the same time, let's face the facts. The United States created ISIS in a backhanded way, certainly. By allowing these human rights abuses to fester in places like Abu Ghraib or Rashid in Iraq. But we know that ISIS's leaders came out of an American military prison in central Iraq. So cut off the arms, respect human rights, close down these prisons no matter where they are, and start treating people with dignity.
And how much of this would translate into a post-Cold War framework that I feel like a lot of policymakers and intelligence people haven't quite grasped yet? It used to be the case during the Cold War that there was a belief, not only in the State Department, but in the intelligence community as well, that it was kind of a zero-sum game, and that whatever means you had at your disposal, you would follow, so that the Soviet Union wouldn't capture the influence of whatever that region or country or system might be. Well, now the Cold War is over, at least so we're told, but we haven't really changed the positioning of anything, it doesn't seem.
No, we haven't. And, I still have a lot of friends in the CIA with whom I speak, and all they talk about these days is Russia, Russia, Russia. Russia's the enemy. Russia's the big problem. We have to be worried about the Russians. And I disagree with that completely. I really do. I think we've dropped the ball on relations with the Russians. I'm no Vladimir Putin fan, certainly. He's a former KGB colonel. But I think that we have more avenues on which we can work with the Russians than we do problems with the Russians. And if we could settle our differences with the Russians, I think it would make the rest of the world an awful lot easier.
And there would be that peace dividend that we never got.
There would be that peace dividend. I remember complaining during the Bush administration that I had never seen a State Department that worked so hard to not exercise diplomacy as George W. Bush's State Department. Mm-hmm. And Barack Obama, for all his faults, and believe me, I'm no Barack Obama fan, he's done the right thing with Iran, and he's done the right thing with Cuba. And we need the right thing to be done with the Russians as well.
But is he doing the right thing with the Iraq-Syria situation?
I don't think so. No.
Yeah,
I mean, just sending arms to a group of doctors and engineers and people who we don't even really know they are is not going to settle the case. The truth is, we have two bad choices. We have Bashar al-Assad and we have ISIS. We're going to have to figure it out. We're going to have to work with the Iranians, on the one hand, and work with the Iraqis on the other.
Well, another perspective, John, would be that we shouldn't really feel like we have a choice. We should just get out of it and let the locals handle it for themselves, no?
Yes.
Well, I would hate to just abandon so many innocents there. The Kurds desperately need some help, even if it's just medicine and food aid. The Yazidis are still being just tormented mercilessly by ISIS. So for human rights reasons, I would like to at least have a humanitarian presence there.
Yeah, I don't think I disagree with that. I don't think that food aid or shelter or even a no-fly zone that doesn't drop bombs on villages, I don't have a problem with that either.
Right.
but expanding drone strikes and sending weaponry and funds and that's not going to work.
No, that's not going to work. It's never worked in the past. There's no reason to think it would work now.
Well, John, I'm afraid we're out of time, but I really appreciate you being with us, and I really encourage people to read your new column at OtherWords. It's called Let's Talk About Torture. We have a link to it from our website, but you can also go to otherwords.org/Let's Talk About Torture. John Kiriakou, former CIA counterterrorism officer, former senior investigator for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Great to be with you.
Thank you. We'll take a brief break, and we'll be right back with Steve Horn. Stay tuned. Welcome back to The Monitor. My name is Mark Badawi. My co-host is Emily Becker, and our guest host is Egberto Willies, joining us for this final segment of the show. Our guest for the remainder of the show is Steve Horn. Steve, welcome.
Good to be here. Thanks for having me.
It's good to have you on. Steve is the editor of DSmog blog. He recently wrote a piece we have a link to from our website called Exclusive: Hillary Clinton's State Department Emails, Mexico Energy Reform, and the Revolving Door. Steve, it's your first time on the show, so I know you may not be familiar with the format, but the aim of the show really is for me to ask one question and get out of the way and give you as much time as possible to explain the story. So tell people who haven't read your column yet what it is you found, what connects the State Department emails with Mexico energy reform, and what is this revolving door?
Absolutely. Well, this story came about as something I've been working on for a while, so it wasn't something that only came from the Hillary Clinton emails. The Hillary Clinton emails themselves actually gave me sort of a good news hook for it, let's say, because those are already a pretty controversial thing because of the basis of the emails, that is, that they were emails stored on her own private server and her own private email address that she was doing State Department business on, which I think a lot of critics think, first of all, flies in the face of the Freedom of Information Act, second of all, flies in the face of National Archives Acts in terms of what will happen to the emails when she's done in the State Department. And so these emails have slowly come out after a lawsuit that was filed by Jason Leopold at Vice News, who's an investigative reporter there, and the State Department's now putting these out once a month at the end of every month, so listeners can expect another batch to come out at the end of August. But so in both batches, there have been some really interesting little tidbits and details about something that I've followed closely for a long time as well, and that is the International Energy Coordinator position at the State Department and what that International Energy Coordinator was tasked with. And one of the things that I've been following also is something called the Global Shale Gas Initiative. It's now called the Unconventional Gas Technical Engagement Program. And basically, the role of the person that was doing this job, the first person ever to do it was David Goldwyn, who I'll talk about a little bit soon.
And this, Steve, sorry to interrupt, this is a State Department position, right?
Correct.
Okay.
State Department position that was actually originally created under President George W. Bush, but it was only really active at that time as far as I could find in my research on stuff pertaining to biofuels in Brazil. And so it wasn't very active on the oil and gas issues, didn't become very active on those issues until Hillary Clinton's State Department during the first term of President Obama, and still active in those areas today, so much so that they've even created a whole bureau in the State Department called the Bureau of Energy Resources. And so that's sort of the big picture here. And so in those emails, you can see that a little bit of detail about how that position was created and who was first hired, and also a description of that position with one caveat. And the caveat is that the entire job description, this was the basis for another article I wrote, is redacted. So We don't know how the State Department was actually describing the person that would fill this position to potential applicants, but the long story short there is that David Goldwyn assumed the position, and you could see some chatter about that in the Hillary Clinton emails in the second batch that basically my article is about. And so going to that, and that gets into the revolving door story, you can see that in the emails that one of the main things that David Goldwyn would be working on is energy reform in Mexico. When I say reform, I mean the privatization of Mexico's energy sector, especially in oil, gas, and electricity. I don't really know how much coal Mexico has, but I think that most of the stuff I've been reading shows that this is pertaining to oil and gas and electricity. And so
it's interesting, before we get to some of the detail, it's interesting that the word reform quite often takes on that meaning. When the IMF is restructuring loans, when the World Bank is tying strings to their loans, they quite often discuss reform, and invariably what that means is privatization. It doesn't tend to mean almost anything else, as far as I can tell.
Right, and so I use the term reform in my article just because that's what powers that be call it, but it is privatization of the entire sector. And so that came about in December 2013, and what wasn't really well understood is the role that the United States government played. What these emails show, and then further research into looking at the WikiLeaks cables, it's very clear that the United States government, in particular David Goldwyn, who was International Energy Coordinator, and also the ambassador to Mexico under Hillary Clinton early on in her tenure, Carlos Pascual, those two were very active on this issue between 2009 and 2013. And so sort of halfway between Hillary Clinton's tenure at the State Department, David Goldwyn steps down from the International Energy Coordinator position, and Carlos Pascual, who was the U.S. ambassador to Mexico, he becomes the International Energy Coordinator. But what remains is that both of them were pushing behind, and I say behind the scenes because this was, if you look at the WikiLeaks cables, you can see that they purposely kept this behind the scenes. They definitely in Mexico and probably even in the United States, because there's a lot of opposition to fracking, a lot of opposition to this new technology. On both sides of the border, they didn't want it to be known the United States was involved. And so in the WikiLeaks cables, they said, we need to be involved in this. This is very important, but we cannot be linked to it at all. It has to be completely off the books. And so, but what the cable shows, they were very involved in it. And I guess the revolving door part of it, to get to that part, is that Goldwyn and Pascual, neither of them work at the State Department anymore. They both left after Hillary Clinton's tenure at the State Department. Goldwyn halfway through, Pascual a little bit into Kerry's tenure, but he hasn't really worked much under John Kerry. And they both left and went to the private sector. And both of them are now doing work pertaining to Mexico, or work at firms that do stuff pertaining to Mexico. So in the case of Pascual, he works at a firm called IHS Inc., which has an entire portfolio connected to energy in Mexico, and they're a consulting firm that does studies and that sort of thing that are basically entirely funded by the oil and gas industry, and often just are part of the kind of the think tank echo chamber. Interestingly, on their part, they're actually a for-profit consultancy, unlike the firms that Goldwyn is affiliated with, like Atlantic Council, like Brookings Institution. And he also has a for-profit consulting firm called Goldwyn Global Strategies. And so Goldwyn is author of lots of these types of reports that are pro-privatization of Mexico's energy sector. And one interesting note about Goldwyn, just days, literally like a week after Mexico's energy privatization passed in Mexico's legislature, and then after the president signed it into law, Peña Nieto, just about a week after that, through the Atlantic Council, he released a report talking about, he knew all the details of the legislation. He and wrote a long report about it, which just to me, that wasn't actually part of my article, but to me that kind of shows that he definitely had quite a bit of behind-the-scenes knowledge of intimate details of the policy, and shows that he's been a key actor on this for a long time. And then
the he you're referring to here is Goldwyn or Pascual?
Goldwyn.
Okay.
Goldwyn, yeah. So Goldwyn here, if and there'll be one more figure I want to talk about. His name is Neil Brown, but Goldwyn, to talk about him for a second. First of all, I think Goldwyn is probably the most important figure in the story of the three that I covered in terms of the revolving door. And that's because he's a guy who's been into and out of the revolving door, private sector, public sector, a couple of times. He used to actually work for the original Clinton administration doing energy-related stuff. Then he went back. Then he went to his consulting firm. He's also affiliated with a law firm called Sutherland, which does legal stuff pertaining to these same issues, and so he's of counsel at that firm. But Goldwyn's also, I just want to highlight, he's a protagonist in the book by Ken Silverstein called The Secret World of Oil, and in that book, Ken Silverstein refers to him as, quote-unquote, a fixer. So what Goldwyn's done through his entire career, Mexico is just one example. He's been a guy who goes into countries with tough situations and attempts to open up markets for, internet, and basically U.S. oil and gas firms like Chevron, like ExxonMobil. And so he's had a whole career of this, and that's highlighted pretty extensively in Ken Silverstein's book. I would say that Mexico is one of the latest chapters of things that he's done. But he's not a well-known figure per se, but he's a very powerful figure in Washington, D.C. And so
before we get to Neil Brown, I just want to spell out some of these details here, because I think that it's possibly some listeners may have missed some of the big plot, which is the state-owned oil and gas company in Mexico, Pemex. I don't know if I'm saying that right. Mm-hmm. They were broken up essentially through a law passed in Mexico and signed by President Peña Nieto. And you're saying in your story that Goldwyn and Pascual and Neil Brown to some extent as well were heavily involved in creating that law.
Correct, at least in terms of the influence of things that they did created an atmosphere in which the passage of this reform was possible. So
when Pemex was broken up, who bought which chunks of it, and what happened now to Mexico's oil and gas former state monopoly?
Yeah, that's a good question. Mostly what happens now is that Pemex can more easily do joint ventures with other companies for exploration and production and drilling. And
many of these companies presumably would be foreign-owned, including American.
Correct, yeah. And so you can already see it in the first, there's been one bid so far. There weren't as many bids as observers thought there would be, but there's been some shallow water, offshore drilling bids, and the companies are from the United States, and so.
So I guess the reason I bring that up is that some people would say possibly, and if you don't know enough about this story or some of the other stories like private medical health insurance or Big Pharma or whatever, you might say, well, people like Neil Brown and Pascual and David Goldwyn, well, they know the industry, they know how things run, and it's perfectly okay for them to go from private to public sector like this because they know how to make things happen, right? What's your response to that?
Well, I would say that I'd have two responses. One is that this is a particular industry, the oil and gas industry, that it's not, I wouldn't say it's akin to other industries, and that maybe in some ways it is, but I think that the actions of it are leading to catastrophic climate change. There's no denial that the consumption and production and all the stuff that has to do with fossil fuels are leading to climate change. So their actions are actually hurting the entire planet, first of all. But second of all, there's just stuff with fracking itself and all of the documented stuff that has to do with water contamination and air pollution in communities. And so they do know this area very well. And actually, their studies are sometimes interesting. They definitely are well documented, but their actions are actually leading to extreme harms, and so I think that's an important detail to keep in mind. And then it's also, I think it's just, yes, they do know the area well, but it's very clear that they traded in their government access for the private sector.
Let me ask you something, though. Isn't this also a theft on the Mexican people in general? The mere fact that we're talking about the privatization of a company that was once under the domain of the public sector?
Introduce yourself.
That's the bigger thing. I mean, the bigger picture here is that it's not just oil and gas. It's basically lots of things that were once public have become private in Mexico under something called El Pacto de Mexico, or the Pact of Mexico.
Yeah.
And so we're talking about sectors, wholesale sectors are being sold off to the private sector. And in this case, the stuff with Pemex, or Petróleos Mexicanos, is extremely unpopular in Mexico through the public polling. I think that about 70% of the Mexican public is against this. And, of course, this has been something that's been public for, I guess, state-owned, at least for about a century, since 1917, I believe. So, that's definitely the broader picture, for sure.
I want to go back to the emails, because I know that's been in the news a lot, and the Democrats and the Clinton backers are saying that the Republicans are making bipartisan hay with this, and there's really nothing to see here. But the way some of the things you've come across through reading these emails, which are now being released, as you said, because of Jason Leopold's lawsuit, and we had Jason on the show many years back. I should probably get him back on. You found something interesting, which I saw on Facebook, about something that Hillary asked to borrow. Just tell people what that is, because it sounded too ridiculous to even be true.
Well, I've gotten some backlash for posting that on Facebook from some, but basically it was a book, an ebook, I think, about...
At least it was an ebook.
Yeah. It was an ebook about proper maintenance of email, and one of the chapters, because it was like a how-to of how to manage email. One of the chapters in the book was about deleting emails and stuff, and then another part of that same chapter was potential repercussions, legal repercussions of deleting emails. So it was like the fine line of how many emails can one delete without also potentially being legally liable. And so the backlash I've gotten is that, well, this was a big book about email maintenance and management, and one chapter in it was about that topic. But it was, it's one of those situations where it's like, well, what was the reason why she was so interested in this book? And also, I think it just adds. There's a story that CBS News picked up on it. It is interesting that was in there. I'm not really sure if that was the reason why she was interested in it, but it is clear that she finds this stuff with email to be. I don't think that it's definitely not any sort of conspiracy. And obviously, the right wing is interested in it for their own partisan purposes. But
sure.
For those who care about transparency and who care about the integrity of the Freedom of Information Act and who care about these sorts of issues, it's definitely very troubling what she did. Of course, we've already seen that there's been newsworthy things in these emails, like the stuff with the International Energy Coordinator position, and other stories that will come out of it that clearly she didn't want out there. And so, if anything, this stuff with email is a public relations problem for her and her campaign. But
now I might be asking you to speculate here a little bit, and I know that's not what journalists are supposed to do. But what do you think is the reason that she was using a private server and a non-State Department email account in the first place? It begs the question.
Well,
3 minutes.
I think that it gets to what I was saying. I think that she wants to manage her image. She wants to keep a certain image of herself out in the public that is not reflected at all in the emails themselves. And so I think that her and her team thought that if she was managing the emails and the server, that they could store things in a certain way and delete
keep them off the books.
I don't think it was because of that chapter in the book. I think that's sort of a coincidence, but I think that coincidence does sort of ring true in a way. I think that this was the entire purpose behind that private server and the private email address, and she's definitely not the only person to ever have done it, but it doesn't mean that it's less troubling.
Sure.
She did it.
No, I think, the Obama administration, which, and I've mentioned this on the air a couple of times in the past as well, won an award for transparency, where the award was given at a ceremony that was closed to the public. It begs a lot of questions. And Steve, we're out of time, I'm afraid, but I really want to thank you for being on the show, for writing this piece, and I encourage people to go to DSmog blog, which we have a link to on our website. That is dsmogblog.com. We also have a link to your article. You're an editor there, and I know you're going to keep working on this, and I'm now on your distribution list, so keep me posted as things develop.
Will do. Thanks a lot for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you. That was Steve Horn. Before him, we had John Kiriakou, who's a columnist with OtherWords. Before that, he was CIA counterterrorism officer and senior investigator for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And of course, before John, we had Egberto Willies, who's still with us in the studio. Egberto, thanks for listening and joining and participating and being part of the show.
It was fun. It was a pleasure. I was honored.
We have about 2 minutes or so left, which is hopefully plenty of time to tell you to tune in every week, of course. And don't forget to check Egberto's show out on Thursdays at KPFT at 3 p.m. for 1 hour. If you're listening in internet land and you want to join the conversation for Egberto's show, you can dial the phone number for the station, 713-526-5738 at any time between 3 and 4. I guess do you have a specific window, like 10 minutes in to 5 minutes before the end or something like that?
As soon as but within 7 to 10 minutes, call-ins are probably ready.
Okay. All right. Well, the music in the background lets us know that we are pretty much out of time. Emily, thanks for being here. You had two people hogging the mics instead of just me this time. Of course, Robert, our engineer, thanks for rolling with the punches and dealing with a slightly unusual format this week. Want to encourage you all, of course, to go to our website, themonitor.wordpress.com. You can also go to facebook.com/monitorradio. And you can follow Egberto on Twitter at Egberto Willies, and you can also follow John Kiriakou and Steve Horn and me on Twitter. All of those links are on our website, and you can send an email to the show anytime you like. The email is themonitor@journalist.com. I think that's all the time we've got, so goodbye, and we'll see you next week. Thanks for listening.